was Andrew with Missing Remote. This is a specialized S-Works power crank. It has the carbon fiber crank arms. These are 175 crank arms, and I'm running a 50-34 chainring on it. This is a bit different from the previous crank that I had on this bike. If you've seen some of the other videos, this crank will look familiar. This is a Shimano Dura-Ace crankset with Pioneer power meter, and wanted to talk about the pluses and minuses of this crank versus that crank, and then in a bit we'll break down the power stuff. So the main reason why I decided to change this crank for this crank is weight. This system, the S-Works cranks plus the bottom bracket versus the Dura-Ace crank plus the bottom bracket, is 158.4 grams lighter. And I mean, I didn't know exactly how much it would be, but I knew it would be a lot lighter total system weight. The crank here plus the chain rings is 598.8 grams, and the bottom bracket assembly is 55. Of that, 134.8 grams is the 50-34 chain ring that's on there. And these are 175 millimeters. Don't remember if I said that or not. So it's going to be, it'll be lighter if you have a 172.5, which is I think a more common size. And then the second reason is that Pioneer and Wahoo are incredibly difficult to work with around the pedal monitoring metrics. That was a big reason why I wanted to get the Pioneer power meter versus other power meters, was that it provides this extra bit of data that other vendors they don't provide that. I did a video on the pedal monitoring thing, so you can kind of see how that works. But there's no way to view that data offline in a comparative way against like elevation or heart rate or any of these other bits of data. If you use a Wahoo computer, and Wahoo, it took a lot of work just to get them to confirm that they're actually writing the data to the fit file, but then they wouldn't provide any documentation around how to extract my data from the fit file so that I could do something useful with it. And Pioneer doesn't support Wahoo's fit files on the website that they have for that kind of thing. It's possible that if I were to use a Pioneer Cyclo computer with it, I could use their website to analyze that kind of data, but I'm not going to buy another computer that doesn't do some other things that I want it to do. And I contacted both of them, and they were both incredibly unhelpful. So I haven't actually been using that for quite a while now. And it's disappointing. It's really disappointing because it's one of the major value adds of the Pioneer system, and then for them to just kind of not make that easy for people to use is, frankly, it's kind of ridiculous. So it was easy to give that up because I wasn't using it. And then the other bit is that I just kind of like to play with this kind of stuff. So, yeah, it was just an interesting thing to try. All right, so these are Praxis Works Buzz rings. That's something that I should note. They're not the specialized rings by Praxis, which are, I don't know, about $40 more than these guys. These work fine. Really there's no reason why you should buy the more expensive specialized by Praxis rings when the Praxis by Praxis Buzz rings work just fine. The other thing that I found that was really beneficial, and it was unexpected, was that the Q factor, or at least I think it's the Q factor, of the S-Works cranks works better for me. The Q factor is significantly different between the S-Work crank and the Shimano crank. Shimano claims 146 for the Q factor on that on the Shimano crank, but I measured it. I'm not sure how they measure it. Maybe they're doing center to center of the crank arm, but when I did the edge to edge, it was like 147.5 or something like that. Specialized is 152. I actually expected it to be narrower because it's a native BB30 crank, but that was unexpected, and it was unexpectedly beneficial to me personally. And it's kind of a strange thing, and I wasn't sure how to present this, because I don't want to be one of those people that just kind of makes crazy claims about things, and I don't have the data to back it up. But so I'm going to go off on a limb here, and I'm going to say that I'm able to hold a specific power for longer with the S-Work crank than with the Shimano crank. And I've collected a whole bunch of rides where this thing, and I noticed it immediately, and I wasn't sure if it was placebo or I thought it was just like some crazy thing, but what has happened is that the average power for my rides, like I do a set ride a few times a week, primarily for this kind of thing, just to have a control, a straight up and back. And the average power for the ride went up immediately. The average speed, which if it was just power, I would say that the power meter is probably just reading different than this power meter. But the average speed went up as well. And it has been consistent. Ride after ride after ride, every single one that I've done since installing the S-Works crank, the average power is higher than the Durace, and the average speed is higher for the same up and back route, and not in an insignificant way either. And it's not. I don't think it's like that my FTP has gone up, because that would be crazy. I think it's more that it just, for those solid state or steady state efforts, I just can hold that number, whatever that number is, for longer before I have to back off. And it's been really interesting and really nice. And I mean, I'm not sure if it's just the Q factor, but that's really the only thing I can think of is that it is the Q factor. And of course, this is going to be a personal thing. So based on the way that your body's geometry works and sets up and all that other stuff. So it worked for me. It may not work for you, but it is a nice thing that I have enjoyed from after changing it. There's one thing that really annoys me about this crank, and that is the mechanism that you use to keep it from going back and forth. In the bottom bracket, there's some rings on the non-drive side, and I'll put a photo up over there somewhere. And they use these tiny 1.5 millimeter, like 3 of these 1.5 millimeter hex bolts to kind of push the inner ring against the crank to keep it from slopping side to side. And those come loose, or at least they have come loose. And because they're 1.5 millimeters, they're so easy to round off. And I'm 100% confident that I will need to replace those bolts, because I'm gonna round them off, because they're just so tiny and so soft, and I have to tighten them, or I have had to tighten them like 3 times. It hasn't moved since the last time when I really cranked them down, but I'm pretty confident that's going to be a problem long term. One other thing that was kind of inconvenient, I guess is probably the best way to say that, is that this is Shimano Di2 derailleur. It works, and shifting's fine, but it was more complicated to set it up with the S-Works crank than it was with the Shimano crank. With the Shimano crank, I just had to adjust the little screw here that controls how far out how far out it comes for the limit. You have to do that with these as well, but then I had to do quite a bit of the tuning in the eTube app to get to work it where this sits back and forth so that it's just perfect and it doesn't rub and it shifts right and doesn't drop the chain, that kind of stuff. Where with the Shimano crank, I guess expectedly, I just kind of like moved that and it just worked. So that's a little bit of a con to just expect to spend a little bit more time, or maybe that's just me. When I set it up, just had took a bit more time to set the mech up versus when I set the mech up for the Shimano crank. Otherwise, shifting performance, I've heard that Praxis rings aren't as good as Shimano. I've also heard the opposite. I think they're about the same, but it's pretty flat here, so I don't do much shifting back and forth. But when I do shift back and forth, it shifts back and forth. Not much issue there. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to do some power comparison, and we can see how the power on here compares against the kicker, and then just some comments around some power stuff that I've captured on some outdoor free rides.